Okay. So I'd like to thank the organisers for inviting me, and also to say, and also for Nora's very enthusiastic and very apt introduction, and also to say how excited I am to be on the same panel as Amit and Nora, and I'm looking forward to the discussion that we'll have. I really appreciated Amit's kind of explosion of the notion and myth of finding the audience, you know. And I guess my talk is about, partly as a curator at Tate Britain, to try and bypass that imperative to define a particular targeted audience around the notion of diversity. So, since the 1990s, the global expansion of art worlds, as evidenced in the huge proliferation of biennials, art fairs, and new museums, has seen a concomitant explosion in writing and reflections on the role of the curator. The curator has, in many respects, become the linchpin of the globalization of the art world. And many curators have begun to reflect on the institutional and non-institutional context of curatorial power and positionality. In this paper, I want to argue for a more self-aware and self-reflexive form of curating based on my experiences as a curator at Tate Britain from roughly 2007 to 2012, a moment which coincided with Nora's time there as well, and we were colleagues. My reflections are in part prompted by a discussion I had with the political sociologist and museums consultant Michael Linnert in his provocative framing of a panel on museums that he convened for a conference called Taste After Bourdieu at Chelsea College of Arts, where I'm based, in May 2014. Linnert described the global moment of museum expansion in relation to the question of taste. I know taste has come up in earlier panels. He spoke about the incredible global expansion in museum building, particularly in the Middle East and East Asia, as well as the struggles many post-colonial nations have with museum models imported from the West. But at the same time, he argued that in the West, in a cultural climate that can be described as post-taste, museums are dealing with the problems of preserving collections and heritage in an adverse economic climate. The question of Tate allegedly having no longer the same relevance or cultural value, to use a disputed term, is in the past. In this paper, I want to challenge the idea that we are in a post-taste global moment, and I want to interrogate the manner in which the rhetoric of a post-taste museology intersects with claims for the globalization of museum cultures. In 1997, the British conceptual artist Richard Wentworth and sculptor devised an installation at the British Museum called Questions of Taste, curated by James Putnam. Wentworth created what he labelled a display using ancient Egyptian drinking vessels from the British Museum's collection, juxtaposed with various modern drinks containers found discarded around the museum. These were placed in a vitrine located in the Egyptian gallery, adjacent to an ancient sarcophagus. Wentworth copied the official museological descriptions and labelling and applied them to the disposable modern tins, cartons, and plastic bottles that were displayed in the vitrines alongside the priceless artifacts, including details of their manufacturing process and the location where they were found. Now, this labeling and juxtaposition set up dialogues between the valuable and the worthless, the precious artifact and discarded rubbish, the unique handmade object and mass-produced packaging. And I think this provocative work, part of a long lineage of artist interventions in museum collections, arguably both reproduced or referred to and critiqued the problematics and fears around the globalization of museum collections. These collections are often articulated around the perceived flattening of culture in the wake of the homogenizing forces of globalization, and therefore are seen to constitute a threat to deeply entrenched notions of the enduring cultural values that are supposedly embedded in national collections, even when these purport to be universal in scope. By placing junk detritus of contemporary global culture, such as soft drink cans, next to venerated ancient cultural artifacts in the same vitrine, the artist appears to be problematizing the notion of a unified or coherent canon of cultural or aesthetic taste in relation to museum objects, posing a challenge that many curators in today's global museums are still coming to terms with. And it's certainly true that the last decade or so has seen many art museums in the West attempting to play catch-up and rushing to belatedly respond to the challenges of globalization. This increased awareness of the global, as we've heard over the course of the last few days, has come from many sources. The rise of the global art market, with its attendant large-scale exhibitions and international art fairs, the increased circulation of artists internationally, the expanded awareness of culturally diverse audiences for museums of modern art, etc. And so there are both international and domestic pressures on museums to become more relevant, to embrace the contemporary by engaging with the notions of the global and cultural diversity. Now this raises problems, of course, particularly in relation to the question of audiences as well as for artists and artworks. What does it mean for a national museum of modern art to embrace global and cultural diversity when their collections are programmatically and ontologically rooted in largely European and North American artworks with their associated Eurocentric art historical, cultural, and epistemological imperatives? What kinds of specific challenges does embracing the global pose to the National Modern Art Museum, charged with the collection and care of works on behalf of the nation? And in relation to questions of taste and audience, what kinds of aesthetic judgments and criteria are to be made that can accommodate both Western and non-Western art in the same gallery on equal terms? In this elusive global moment, we are, I think, grappling with new configurations of culture, media, where we are grappling with new configurations of culture, media, and spectatorship. I would actually question any characterization of museum culture in the West as post-taste. This rather premature assumption seems to be here that postmodernist museology and post-colonial paradigms have successfully challenged and vanquished outmoded notions of taste and aesthetic quality in the drive towards market-driven notions of cultural value. The market here is seen as the great leveler and flattens all cultural hierarchies. As Banksy says, we now all exit the museum through the gift shop, right? However, I would question whether notions of taste and judgment, the ignorance of the impact of the global, and the challenges to art's historical canon that Richard Wentworth addressed in his installation at the British Museum have been really taken on board by museums. As Victoria Walsh and Andrew Dewdney, two of my colleagues who are here today, have argued, drawing on research they undertook with David DeBosa at Tate Britain in the Tate Encounters projects between 2007 and 2011, there still exists a hierarchy of taste that runs throughout many museums from the top to the bottom. And based on an in-depth organizational study across all departments at Tate Britain, they argue that the organization of the museum continues to be based on a hierarchy of taste and viewing that travels in one direction only, defined by the modernist paradigm, from the vision of the artist, the intermediary of the dealer and private collector, through the authority of the expert curator and historian, and finally, to an assortment of museum departments whose job is to manufacture the audience. In particular, they point to the complicity of traditional curatorial practices based on narrow, purely aesthetic criteria of taste that perpetuates such hierarchies in museums and are often at odds with the changing nature of museum spectatorship and audiences. So this emphasis on, they quote, this emphasis on a prevalent modernist presentation of works of art to create a predominantly aesthetic experience distinguished and suspended from spatio-temporal relations of the everyday invariably feeds into and extends to the tradition of viewing and taste founded in connoisseurship, which defines the core audience of marketing strategies. This hierarchy is reflected in the division of labor and relations of power between the curatorial department in an institution such as Tate Britain, which largely works, arguably, with this aesthetic version of modernist presentations of works of art, and on the one hand, on the other hand, the learning department, which attempts to put these works into a wider political and social context in which much contemporary art circulates. Part of the central dilemma at Tate Britain has faced since its inception in 2000, when it was separated from Tate Modern, is how to reconcile the historic collection, which consists of many works by non-British artists, such as Van Dyck and Geerhurst, for example, who nevertheless make up the canon of British art, on the one hand, and the contemporary collection within the framework of an idea of Britishness in art, which of course is under constant pressure from the globalization of the art world to remain valid categories or applicable labels, however defined. And it was in this context that new initiatives to tackle some of these issues emerged within the learning department at Tate Britain when I was there almost 10 years ago. The idea of developing cross-disciplinary knowledge within the museum in order to change the culture of the institution was one of the key triggers behind the creation of the post curator of cross-cultural programs in Tate Britain in 2005. Felicity Allen, then the head of learning at Tate Britain, conceived the role in the following terms. She said, in an interview with a Tate employee, she said, "I felt very strongly that there was a real lack of knowledge and confidence, and that actually what we really needed to do was to get more people from different backgrounds into the department, the learning department, to help generate the knowledge that we could use to generate the audiences and the content." It was also true that several others in the department that I recruited had different specialisms and didn't come from visual arts backgrounds. When I inherited the department, the majority of staff had art history degrees, and as a group represented a narrow range of age, culture, and religion. I shifted this to include people with a much broader range of disciplinary specialisms and life experience. The latter was as important as subject specialism, and if you like, a habit of reflexivity. So the creation of this new post opened up a space for Tate Britain to engage with complex questions of cultural identity that had long been in circulation in both the academy and in activist associations. At that time, the ability to engage with these questions lay outside of the specialist fields of knowledge of the curators in the curatorial department, who were mainly focused, as I mentioned, on this aesthetic model of curating described by Walsh and Dewdney. Now, coming from a background myself as an urbanist and researcher in urban and cultural studies, I was appointed as curator of cross-cultural programs at Tate Britain in 2007, succeeding the writer and historian Mike Phillips, the first holder of the post. Part of my institutional remit was to develop culturally diverse audiences, quote, for the museum by devising a more inclusive public program of events, lectures, and workshops. And whilst most diversity-based education programs in the museum sector have tended to focus on bringing in new audiences through targeted programs and activities, an important aspect of the cross-cultural role was to create alternatives to dominant paradigms of knowledge production, both in gallery education and curatorial practice at Tate Britain. And it was in this aspect of the remit that I invested in much more than the audience development. In other words, I invested in the very notion that public programming, curating, and gallery education in a hierarchical organization such as Tate Britain could in itself be a critical form of research to produce alternative forms of knowledge about British art in the context of migration. The cross-cultural program worked at unpacking the contradictions and tensions between the historic and contemporary poles of the collection by addressing issues about what constituted the kind of knowledge that are produced by the museum in relation to this thing called British art, which itself is a very unstable formation. The question of the colonial past and its relation to the present, for example, has long been addressed by the works of many Black and Asian artists in Britain. And this is precisely at the heart of relations between the historic and the contemporary and how this is articulated as British. The cross-cultural program attempted to address this by focusing and interrogating discourses and practices around British art in relation to the questions posed by post-colonial and Black artists, and also wider questions around the transnational and global nature of art. The program attempted to achieve this through a number of themed strands of activity based within the public program department, encompassing talks and discussions, live arts events, gallery-led interventions, and academic conferences. So, for example, one strand of work called Conversation Pieces interrogated the tape-written collection from the vantage point of artistic practice in order to facilitate a cross-disciplinary and culturally diverse dialogue between a range of artists and specific works in the tape collection that influenced their practice. The photographer Ingrid Pollard, who took part in this project, critically examined the articulation of landscape and national identity in several key historic landscape works in the tape-written collection in her talk and gallery intervention. She located these works in relation to her own photographic practice by placing black figures in the English countryside in her seminal 1998 work, Pastoral Interlude. Another strand of work that I organised, the Status of Difference series, invited a range of international theorists, curators, artists, and writers to address the urgency of mapping new ideas and methods of understanding cultural difference in a transnational context marked by the aggressive return of national identities and fundamentalisms. And these discussions range from cultural critic Cobham and Mercer's analysis of the entangled and cross-cultural hierarchies of modern art practices to, I'm nearly finished, by the way, to curator Thelma Golden's statement on the international resonance of American debates on post-black art in the 1990s, to the Otolith Group's performative framing of strategies of turning one's back to power in a screening and lecture performance about their film Nervous Ruin that depicted the everyday acts of resistance of Palestinian refugees in the Jenin refugee camp in the West Bank. One of the most frustrating aspects about my experience as curator of cross-culture, so those are just a few examples of some of the programs that I engage with. I mean, I was also working with exhibitions and many other events, but in the time I have, those are just a few, just to give you a kind of a sense. So one of the most frustrating aspects about my experience as curator of cross-cultural programs was that it was often misunderstood as a synonym or metonym for diversity. Most people within and outside the institution viewed my post through the narrow lens of targeted audience development. In other words, to develop more diverse audiences, etc., and address questions of representation and identity in relation to the institutional profile. Now, whilst I understood the symbolic importance to the institution of my position as a black curator at a high-profile national museum with a title of cross-cultural, the focus of my research and programming extended way beyond the limits of audience representation. Through the various strands of programs that I sought to invest in and research, forms of art practice, curatorial narratives, and musicological debates that centrally engage the question of cultural difference in a local and global frame. Now, of course, the question of cultural difference addresses issues of representation identity, but at the same time, is also at the same time essential to understanding contemporary art practices, objects, and actions. Now, the program attempted to open up and explore key questions that trouble the fraught interfaces of Britishness and the global, the historic and the contemporary, the colonial and the post-colonial, asking questions as, what is the art saying and doing? What kinds of creative strategies and concerns can open up new worldly understandings of Britishness and British art and in its place, the vortex of contemporaneity? The cross-cultural program contributed to debates, I'm closing here, about forms of knowledge production in the art museum, their relation to dominant hierarchies of taste and power, and reflected on the challenges opened up by new configurations of art practice, which challenge modernist framings of the autonomous artwork. At the recent opening of the new Tate extension, the claim was made that the museum is dedicated to presenting a fully, the words were used, fully global view of art. This, of course, was launched at Tate Modern with the backdrop of the new tanks and the shining new ziggurat building. The cross-cultural program, from the archaic and rather schizophrenic vantage point of Tate Britain, attempted to ask, in a way, a different question. What version of the global is Tate dealing with? And how does it relate to the global migrant cultures that thrive on the doorsteps of the museum in the city itself? And there I'll end. Thank you.